First, though, we're joined by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Alan Tudge. Mr Tudge, thanks very much for your time. First of all, this story on the pensions. Yesterday we learnt that 80,000 part pensioners will lose the part pension given their private wealth, their private assets. Now we learn about some of the sweeteners. The concession card access will remain.
Good morning, Kieran. Well, as you know overall, Kieran, the details will be revealed in the budget, but we want to make sure that the pension is as generous as possible but also sustainable in the long term. It's the biggest aspect of the budget is the pension. It's growing by about 6.2% per annum. So our effort is to ensure that it is generous to those who need it but also sustainable. Now, previously, in the last budget, we took a measure to the Parliament, which was to index the pension to CPI. We've struggled to get that through the Parliament, so we're looking at alternative measures, some of which we've been discussing here and elsewhere.
One of the arguments against changes to super is that you shouldn't change the plan for people midway through their retirement. What about this, though, for retirees, part pensioners who have, of course, many of them several years into their retirement, now going to lose what was an arrangement put in place back in 2007?
Well, let's just wait for the details in the budget. That will be all revealed next week. But overall, Kieran, as I said, we need to make sure the budget is sustainable for the long term. And at the moment, we've got an ageing population. The pension is growing by 6.2% per annum, which is not at a sustainable growth rate. Now, we want to ensure that it's generous, absolutely as generous as we can possibly be with the pension for those people. But at the same time, if you've got significant financial assets so that you can be self-sustaining, then let's have a look at those people also.
All right, look, but I guess the superannuation question remains. The minister says that if someone's built up a nest egg, that they, have the right to access that. Of course they do, but I guess it's about equity, because the tax and transfer system, the tax and welfare system, they can't be seen as separate entities, can they? Because it's the government revenue and use of government revenue that we're talking about in totality. You're forsaking government revenue through generous tax treatment of super on the one hand, and yet reducing the eligibility for those presumably less well off when it comes to the pension.
Well, in relation to the superannuation system, that provides incentives for people to set aside their own money to go into the superannuation system, to then be able to pay for their own retirement down the track. That's the whole intent of the super system. And we're very concerned about Labor's approach, which is to tax those people who have done the right thing in terms of setting aside money for their own retirement. That's what their proposal is. On the other side of the ledger, we're looking at measures overall to make the pension system, which is a welfare safety net, more sustainable in the long run. We still want it to be there, we still want it to be generous for those people who need it, but where you do have substantial assets of your own, then clearly it should taper out. And of course we are looking at one of those measures which was introduced by Peter Costello and John Howard back in 2007, when the budget was $20 billion in the surplus. We had $40 billion in the bank, but that was a hit to the budget of $1 billion per annum. So that's one of the things which has been put to us to re-examine.
Now, let's look at this GST payday. It's the story in the West Australian I referred to in my introduction. $499 million extra for WA road projects that will effectively keep the WA share of the GST at existing levels. This is to placate WA, of course, in terms of the GST, but politically as well. How's this going to go down in the other states?
Well, Kieran, everybody understands the Western Australian position where they were going to receive less than 30 cents in every dollar of GST collected in that state. And so I think we have a bit of empathy for that position. I think some other states have empathy for that position as well. So what's going to be announced later today is the bringing forward of some additional roads funding to be provided to Western Australia. In conjunction with that roads funding, we're going to be asking Western Australia to also undertake some microeconomic reforms similar to what some of the eastern states have done, such as privatisations and extending trading hours. But this is a standalone agreement with the Western Australian government. It doesn't affect the other states, and so they should be comfortable.
Will this money be, contingent on those reforms being undertaken?
It won't be contingent, but it's our expectation that they will undertake some of those reforms to ensure that they can grow as strongly as they can in that state. Other states in the east have undertaken those reforms to their benefit, and we think that the Western Australian government would also benefit from undertaking those.
Now, you say there was some sympathy from the other states. There wasn't a lot from your state, from Daniel Andrews, from South Australia as well, and even New South Wales did not want any change to the GST mix. Will these be seen as special treatment for a political soft spot for the coalition right now?
Well, this arrangement won't impact on any other state, so those states will continue to receive their GST payments as per usual. This will be an additional measure for Western Australia, in part due to the fact that their GST payments were going to fall below that 30 cents in the dollar, and it will be bringing forward some roads funding. All right.
Now let's look at this story. The tragedy in the Mediterranean continues with the flow of boats and asylum seeker deaths. Now there's a report in The Australian this morning suggesting that European officials sought and received a high-level briefing from Australian government officials on Operation Sovereign Borders. Are you aware of that and what was discussed?
Kieran, my understanding is that this was a meeting which occurred in Sydney, and about 12 European officials were seeking information about our successful border protection policies. Now, everybody knows that we had significant problems in terms of people smugglers exploiting the loose laws which the Labor Party put in place and that we have since strengthened. So we've stopped the drownings at sea, we've broken the back of the people smuggling business. Now, the Europeans have got very similar problems. They've got people drowning at sea, they've got thousands of people who are being exploited by people smugglers, and so they've been inquiring about how we did it, what the successful policies were that we put in place to see if there's any lessons that they can learn.
But I guess there are big question marks as to whether or not these lessons are transferable, given we're talking about asylum seekers coming through transit countries, whereas in Europe it's a very different situation. This is coming from countries where these individuals are facing persecution.
Every situation is slightly different, but at the same time it still does involve a criminal people smuggling business, exploiting people's vulnerabilities, and it involves hundreds of people, in the case of the Mediterranean, drowning at sea. And clearly that's not a satisfactory situation. Now, what policies they introduce is completely up to them, but they've been inquiring to understand exactly what we've done, because we've clearly had a very successful border protection policy in place here.
And finally, Mr Tudge, on this issue or this controversy from Paris, where the Australian ambassador to France offered his resignation after he was asked by the Prime Minister's protocol staff to have his partner of 32 years stay in the car. What's the Prime Minister's position on this? Was that badly handled?
Kieran, you're referring to an article which is running in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age by Peter Harcher, and I think it's actually a disgraceful article because it has the implication that the Prime Minister wanted a gay person not to greet him on the tarmac when he arrived in Paris. I think that's a disgraceful allegation. I think that should be withdrawn. No such thing occurred. There are protocols in place which were asked to be adhered to, but the Prime Minister has a very good relationship with Ambassador Brady and his partner. He had dinner with the pair of them that night. I understand that he had dinner with the pair of them before they went to France. So it was a disgraceful smear, that article, and I think that the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age should have a look at themselves, and they should be doing much better than that.
But why should a politician's or the Prime Minister's staffer tell an ambassador what to do in that sense? Isn't that against protocol?
Look, Listen, my understanding, Kieran, of what actually occurred was that there's a usual protocol, from my understanding, that when the Prime Minister is travelling with his spouse, then he would be greeted on the ground by the Ambassador and his or her spouse. In this instance, the Prime Minister was travelling alone, and in that instance, the usual protocol, is my understanding, is that the Ambassador would therefore greet the Prime Minister by him or herself. My understanding, I haven't spoken to the Prime Minister directly, my understanding was that the Prime Minister was, in fact, greeted by Ambassador Brady and his partner, and the Prime Minister was warmly welcomed and had no problem with that. Of course he didn't.
All right, Alan Tudge, appreciate your time. We'll chat to you soon. A quick break.